August 2025, NORAD Command Center, Colorado Springs. An alert flashes across the central screen. Russian bombers approaching North American airspace through the Arctic corridor. The officer on duty reaches for the communication link. Not to Washington, to Bagotville, Quebec. Because without Canadian airspace, radar coverage, and fighter bases, NORAD goes blind. The Pentagon cannot defend America without Canada saying yes first. And right now, Canada is reconsidering whether that yes still makes sense. This is the story of a military alliance where the junior partner holds all the geographic cards, where 40% of the world's second largest country creates a strategic choke point the superpower cannot bypass, where the Pentagon just realized that losing Canadian cooperation would devastate American homeland defense more than losing an entire carrier strike group. The Americans built the world's most powerful military. But they forgot one thing. Geography doesn't negotiate, and Canada owns the geography that matters most. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Pentagon strategists are losing sleep over decisions being made in Ottawa right now. The Arctic reality Washington ignored. Start with a map, not the one from your classroom. The polar projection map that shows what the Arctic actually looks like from above. From Moscow to New York, the shortest route doesn't cross the Atlantic. It crosses the Arctic. Directly over Canada. Russian bombers flying toward American cities take the polar route. Chinese cruise missiles heading for Alaska. Transit Canadian airspace first. Any hypersonic weapon launched from Siberia toward the continental United States passes through Canadian territory for thousands of kilometers. The Pentagon commands 11 aircraft carrier strike groups, hundreds of overseas bases, an $877 billion defense budget. Yet they cannot defend their own homeland without Canadian permission to use Canadian airspace, radar systems, and fighter bases positioned across the Arctic approach. Canada controls 40% of its landmass north of the 61st parallel. That's 1.6 million square kilometers of Arctic territory. 3 ocean approaches, the Northwest Passage connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific, and the airspace that Russian bombers must cross to threaten American cities. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, isn't an American system that Canada joins. It's a binational system that cannot function if Canada withdraws. Every radar station from Alaska to Greenland feeds into a network depending on Canadian infrastructure, Canadian territory, and Canadian consent. And that consent is no longer automatic. Because Canada just discovered leverage Washington didn't think existed. The $77 billion pressure point. Canada is evaluating an 88 aircraft fighter purchase, the F-35. Total program cost over 40 years, $77 billion. But there's an alternative, the Swedish Gripen. Program cost, $32 billion. That's a $45 billion difference. The Americans are pushing hard for the F-35, not because it's the best fit for Canadian requirements. Because if Canada buys Gripen, it signals that NATO's second largest geographic territory believes American stealth fighters are overpriced and underperforming. That signal would ripple through every NATO ally evaluating fighter purchases. Poland, Spain, Romania. If Canada walks away from the F-35, the entire export market starts asking the same questions Canada is asking. Russian bombers approaching from the Arctic. Gripen handles that mission perfectly at $4,700 per flight hour versus the F-35's $36,000. Chinese naval expansion in the Arctic. Sweden designed Gripen specifically for dispersed operations in Arctic conditions. Defense of Canadian sovereignty? That's about availability and operating costs, not stealth that stops working at minus 40 degrees Celsius. The Pentagon needs Canada to buy F-35s more than Canada needs F-35s. Because the moment Canada publicly chooses a European alternative, the narrative of American fighter superiority collapses in the global defense market. And Canada knows it. Which brings us to the infrastructure dependency Washington won't admit exists. The NORAD infrastructure Washington cannot replicate. NORAD was established in 1958, a joint American-Canadian command responsible for aerospace warning and control for North America. Equal partners on paper. Look at the actual infrastructure. The North Warning System. 47 radar sites stretching from Alaska across northern Canada to Labrador. 39 of those sites sit on Canadian territory. Without those radars, The Pentagon goes blind to threats approaching from the Arctic and Atlantic. CF-18 fighter bases, Bagotville in Quebec, Cold Lake in Alberta. These aren't secondary bases supporting American operations. These are primary intercept points for threats approaching through Canadian airspace before they reach American targets. 5 Canadian Forces bases provide critical surveillance, communication relay, and fighter response for NORAD operations. If Canada closed access tomorrow, the Pentagon would lose the ability to detect and intercept threats over millions of square kilometers. The Americans cannot replicate that infrastructure. You cannot build radar coverage over Canadian Arctic territory without Canadian permission. You cannot operate fighter bases on Canadian soil without Canadian agreement. You cannot defend the northern approach to American cities without Canadian cooperation. This is not a favor Canada provides. This is a structural dependency the Pentagon cannot eliminate. And that dependency is becoming a crisis because of what's happening in the Arctic right now. The Arctic sovereignty crisis forcing the reckoning. Russia operates 40 military bases along its northern coastline. They operate 40 icebreakers. They conduct regular bomber patrols testing North American defenses. They've reactivated Soviet-era Arctic bases and built new ones. China is building icebreakers, declaring itself a near-Arctic state despite being thousands of kilometers from the Arctic Circle, investing in Arctic shipping routes and resource extraction. The Arctic is becoming the most strategically contested region on Earth, and Canada controls the North American side of that contest. The Northwest Passage. As Arctic ice melts, this route through Canadian Arctic waters becomes navigable. China wants it as a commercial shipping route. Russia wants it as a strategic corridor. The United States wants to ensure it remains under Allied control. But here's the problem. Canada claims the Northwest Passage as internal Canadian waters. The United States claims it's an international strait. That disagreement has been politely ignored for decades. But as the passage becomes economically and militarily valuable, the disagreement is becoming a crisis. If Canada decides the Americans aren't respecting Canadian Arctic sovereignty, Canada can restrict access, close military cooperation, and reduce information sharing. The Pentagon loses its primary mechanism for monitoring and controlling the Arctic approaches to North America. The Americans need Canadian cooperation in the Arctic far more than Canada needs American support. Because Canada's sovereignty claim over Arctic waters is strengthened by Canadian presence and Canadian action, not by American validation. And this brings us to the pressure campaign that backfired spectacularly. The F-35 pressure that validated Canadian doubts. The Pentagon has been pushing Canada to buy F-35s since 2010. Political pressure, diplomatic pressure, defense industry lobbying. The message was clear: buy American or face consequences in the defense partnership. Canada initially committed, then reconsidered, then committed again, then opened a new competition. The procurement has been delayed, reviewed, and debated for 15 years. Why? Because Canadians started asking a simple question: what do we actually need these fighters for? Defending Canadian Arctic airspace from Russian bombers. Gripen does that for $45 billion less. Operating from dispersed Arctic bases in extreme cold, where F-35s achieve 47% readiness, while Gripens achieve 92%. Gripen was designed for exactly that, maintaining a credible air force without bankrupting the defense budget. The math speaks for itself. The more the Pentagon pushed, the more Canadians questioned whether American pressure was about Canadian security or American defense industry profits. And that questioning is now extending beyond fighter jets to the entire defense relationship. If the Pentagon treats Canada as a subordinate that must buy American equipment regardless of Canadian interests, why should Canada prioritize American defense concerns over Canadian sovereignty? That question is being asked in Ottawa right now, and the Pentagon doesn't have a good answer, because the geographic reality cannot be negotiated away. The geography trump card that cannot be bypassed. Canada is the only country on Earth that shares both Arctic and Atlantic approaches to the United States. The only NATO ally positioned between Russia and American cities. The only partner whose territory is essential for American homeland defense. The Pentagon can operate in Europe without Canada, can project power in the Pacific without Canadian bases, can conduct Middle Eastern operations without Canadian participation. But they cannot defend the continental United States from Arctic threats without Canadian cooperation. That's not a political choice. That's geographic reality. Canada controls access to the polar route, the radar coverage over the Arctic approach, the fighter bases positioned to intercept threats before they reach American airspace. You cannot purchase that geography. You cannot replicate it. You cannot bypass it. The Americans spent $1 trillion on the F-35 program, but they cannot spend their way out of dependence on Canadian geography. And that geographic dependency extends beyond military infrastructure into economic leverage Canada rarely uses. The economic leverage Canada has never weaponized. Canada is America's largest trading partner. $2.7 billion in bilateral trade crosses the border every single day. Canadian energy exports keep American refineries running. Canadian critical minerals supply American defense manufacturing. The Pentagon's supply chain for military equipment depends on Canadian aluminum, Canadian nickel, Canadian rare earth processing. The F-35 program itself has Canadian companies manufacturing over 900 parts for the aircraft. If Canada decided to restrict export of strategic materials or defense components, American military production would face immediate disruptions, not hypothetical future problems, immediate supply chain breakdowns. Canada has never weaponized this economic leverage, but the option exists. And as the Pentagon pressures Canada on defense procurement, Canadian policymakers are increasingly aware that economic interdependence cuts both ways. The Americans need Canadian resources for their defense industrial base. They need Canadian energy for economic stability. They need Canadian trade for prosperity. Canada needs American trade too. But the relationship isn't as one-sided as Washington assumes. And that assumption is becoming dangerous, because Canada is exploring alternatives that give Pentagon planners nightmares. The alliance realignment that terrifies Washington. If Canada walks away from the F-35, where does Canada turn? Europe, specifically Sweden and the United Kingdom through the Gripen and potential future Tempest partnerships. Sweden offers Canada strategic independence, no vendor lock-in, no political pressure, no subordination to American foreign policy, just capability for cost defense partnerships that respect Canadian sovereignty. If Canada shifts toward European defense partnerships for fighter aircraft, that opens the door for broader defense cooperation that doesn't run through Washington. Joint Arctic operations with Nordic countries. Defense industrial cooperation with European manufacturers. Intelligence sharing that doesn't automatically include the United States. The Pentagon's nightmare scenario isn't Canada leaving NATO. It's Canada remaining in NATO but building defense relationships that reduce dependence on American systems and American approval. That scenario becomes more likely every time the Pentagon treats Canada as a subordinate rather than a sovereign ally. By the way, if you're seeing how geographic leverage reshapes power dynamics even between allies, make sure to subscribe for more analysis that shows you the real strategic chess games happening behind diplomatic headlines. Why this matters right now. The Pentagon faces strategic competitors in China and Russia, contested domains in space and cyberspace, technological challenges in hypersonics and artificial intelligence. The one thing they cannot afford is losing reliable access to Canadian territory for homeland defense. Yet that's exactly what Pentagon pressure on Canada risks creating. Every time the Americans treat Canada as a subordinate, they push Canada toward European partnerships. Every time they dismiss Canadian sovereignty concerns in the Arctic, they weaken the alliance. Every time they pressure Canada to buy American equipment regardless of Canadian interests, they validate Canadian doubts about American reliability as a partner. The Pentagon needs to recognize a simple truth. Canada is not a subordinate ally that can be pressured into compliance. Canada is a sovereign nation with geographic leverage that determines whether American homeland defense functions. Treating Canada as an equal partner who can choose Swedish fighters, assert Arctic sovereignty, and pursue independent defense policies isn't weakness. It's recognition of reality. The alternative is Canada drifting toward European partnerships, restricting American access to Arctic territory, and reducing cooperation in NORAD. That alternative would devastate American homeland defense more than losing 10 aircraft carriers. Because you can build carriers, you cannot build Canadian geography. The Pentagon has more firepower, more carriers, more stealth fighters.